Well, thank you again for all of you for joining. We're going to talk about irrigation in the landscape. And I have this prepared in a number of different ways. And these are some of the considerations or sort of the program outline. First of all, I think just a somewhat philosophical question, is irrigation that we put out primary or supplementary? And there are a number of ways you can think about that. If you're, I guess what I'm getting at here is it's something that you put out and the plant grows as a result of it, and anything you get as a bonus, or do you consider it to be primarily so well adapted that you just have to add to it from time to time? And, again, there are a lot of iterations of that. I just saw a piece about hydroponic gardening, and in that case, it's probably primary, because you got to have that water going all the time and the nutrients are in there. You think about a lawn going dormant for the summer, maybe that's supplementary. So it just helps us think about it. And then the second one, a drier and wetter than average growing season, how that affects us in spring, summer, and fall. We'll talk about irrigation methods and equipment for each groups of plants. And I think that's going to drive a lot of this. And then from an efficiency standpoint, I like to think about what happens to the water after it leaves the equipment, whatever equipment you're using. Testing for soil moisture is important. We want to know how much is in the root system. Drawing a little bit of a difference between new and mature plants. Specific plant moisture needs of various types of plants. And then when plants are nearby, the effects that might have. And then some bottom lines. So we'll move our way through here. And again, please put in your questions in the Q&A section, and then we'll catch up. And like I was saying, irrigation events would be primary if the property owner or the plant owner intends to be really the only waterer or irrigator. And irrigation events would be supplementary if the property owner intends to just add to what Mother Nature provides. So, from a standpoint of what we have there, it really does matter just a little bit. Now, Nicole and I were just chatting here about 15 minutes ago. This is a recent drought monitor map of what's been going on the last 3 weeks or so in the state. And this is kind of a flip-flop, really. We usually think of pretty severe drought in the West, and more average moisture, 28 inches or so per year in the east. And then this little sliver in Richardson County, Falls City, of really no drought. So really interesting to see that. But this is, just go to droughtmonitor.unl.edu and you'll see updated maps of these. The redder, the more droughty. And so pretty dry in that east central area. And then of course you can see the Platte River running through. So now typically you have expectations of more moisture from Mother Nature in the spring, not so much in the summer, and then a return to moisture in the fall most of the time. But certainly the wetter or drier will influence how we irrigate plants from the beginning. So we'll talk about some of the groups now. The irrigation equipment, there's a variety of different types of irrigation equipment that we can use, and we do all of these with sort of this right plant, right place, and irrigation efficiency in mind. This is what we call leaky pipe, which is sort of recycled car or truck tires, reformulated and extruded into a pipe form. And this works pretty well because it doesn't splash water up on the plant, which tends to encourage foliar diseases, and it puts water right on top of the root system and it lets it soak in. So this works pretty good. Now it works best for, as you can see here, linear plants, and so it works good in a vegetable garden, but it's certainly not the only types. These are some of our master gardeners at work, and they're putting out sort of a version of that in this sweet potato patch. This is sort of a spaghetti tubing. It's a little bit different where the water is only going to come out at the end of that tube that this master gardener is poking into the supply line. And again, pretty efficient, not throwing a lot of water up into the sky, doing pretty well there, and gets these plants off to a good start, especially if you're mulching over the top of them. So pretty happy that they're using this type of technology. This is what I would refer to as sort of bubbler technology. On the left, there's some cucurbit type of plants with the similar type of technology where water is sort of just trickling out. There's sometimes a stake in the ground to hold it in place so it doesn't flop around and stays kind of near the base of the plant. On the far right-hand side is one that my engineering oriented neighbor put in. And it's really just PVC pipe, and then he drilled into it at various places, whereas tomatoes and peppers were. And it's sort of a version of the water just coming out in a stream. It's a little bit more forceful than what you see on the left, but I think it also does a pretty good job of avoiding wetting the foliage and letting the drift of the air blow it away. And it's not all that expensive. Just, I think he bought the whole schmear at one of the box stores for about 50 bucks. So pretty good deal. Now, of course, if you put it in the wrong place, then you have to plug the hole and then move it over. But a little bit of pre-planning works pretty well. So those are some ideas for vegetable gardens. There are some that don't work so well that we'll see in a bit. We also have some container gardens. Now, a lot of people like to have patio planters. Those are my feet in the foreground, the far right that you see. And I'm watering with a typical over-the-head type of water breaker. It's a dram water breaker. And I'm not throwing the water too far in the air, and I'm trying to move it around to wet all of the bases of these plants. You can see what has become more popular over the years on the right. And these are either the handheld or the sort of the extension types of multi mode, I guess I would call them. Usually there's about 6 to 8 different modes, from jet to a drizzle, like a mist, to a direct stream, to an angle, to a flat. And you can wash your car with these, but you can also water a lot of plants with these. The one on the left is handheld. The one on the right works really well for hanging baskets because it gives you an extra 2 feet of extension. Or if you have a hard time getting to that plant for whatever reason, it helps a little bit with ambulatory possibilities as well. So these are becoming more and more popular, and you probably want to buy one that's fairly heavy duty. Sometimes I've been given gifts of them that don't last much more than the season. So put just a little bit of money into it. But they can be used for a variety of reasons, whether it's an in-ground plant we see on the right or whether it's a container. As we saw before with the some of the irrigation for the vegetables, you can also use the same type of technology for patio planters or outdoor containers or indoor containers for that matter, where it's a efficient water delivery on a stick. And here it's a kind of a micro spray type of technology where you turn on the system and then it's on a timer. And then periodically it goes off and just a fine spray. And usually about, a dozen streams of water will water the base of this plant, and it would run for, you'd have to kind of test it out. It might need 10 minutes of the spray. It might need 15 minutes. It might need 5 minutes. A lot of it just depends on how well drained the soil is and the pressure on the system. With all of these types of devices, we do recommend a filter and a timer. And probably the filter is more important than the timer, but you can see the filter there in the photo. And it's good because there can be contaminants and particulates in the water, and it's good to filter them out. Otherwise, they just clog up the orifice, or that little round ball that you see on the left. So a filter can be helpful, and just like it is in your air conditioner or in your HVAC system by your furnace, it's important to use them. And they're not all that expensive, but it is good to have them in line. Now, on the left, you wouldn't know that this is a drip system for these containers for this sort of brownstone home. They look great, but they are on a same kind of a drip system as you saw in that last photo. The only reason that this caught my eye was because I saw the supply lines. Now, if this were kind of looped over and behind that retaining wall or that walk up on the right, you wouldn't have even seen that, and I wouldn't have even noticed it when I took the picture. But this is the same address, same house, but it's again efficient because we're not throwing a lot of water. And from a slippage standpoint, we're not throwing water all over the steps and up on the ledge and any of that kind of thing. It's just the right amount is coming out right at the base. And so again, this is probably one of those things you invest in once and can use for several years before you have to change it out. Now, this is the one that I was talking with John about just a little bit. This is the one that I am least familiar with and just learned about maybe a month ago. I was listening to a couple of the major greenhouse growers supply orientation. It was from the National Garden Bureau, the same people that bring us the All America selections. And one of the growers and plant developers, the plant breeders, their company participates in all of these programs. And one of the participants in this webinar that I was participating in mentioned that she had gotten into self-watering containers lately. And it worked really well because she was sort of a traveling person. And these are not cheap. These are about $150 a piece. But the big idea here is that instead of having to water it every other day, as you would for many containers, this you would water and fill up, every 3 weeks or so. And they basically have a reservoir. And from what I understand, they water through capillary action. John, do you know any more information on this than what I just said?
I think this is like a new type of self-watering containers, because of course, self-watering containers have been around for a long time. So I think maybe these, I haven't seen these, but a lot of them are, if it's capillary action, there could be some sort of like wicking or some sort of like felt material that pulls the water up into the soil level. So I think, like you said, they're expensive. They're probably some sort of new take on, a new design on something that's been done. But, if it works for you and you have the dollars, then, that might be something worth looking at.
Sure, and it's something to experiment with, and it's one of these another options. It'd be something that if you have a hard time being home every other night to water, and you're in a particularly windy area, might be just another option for you. I haven't used these personally, but I sure would like to try it. It's probably pros and cons. You leave water in a container for a month. Well, maybe there are some issues with it. It may be harder to fertilize with this kind of a system, but I sure like the convenient part of it. So it'd be something, if any of you have tried a device like this, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. And it'd be good to get your take on this as well. This type of watering device has been out there for many years. It's called Netafim. And instead of the water deliverer or the emitter being outside of the supply line, it's inside. And this works really good for small, narrow spaces. And as you can see, a close-up of the little round dot there on the left, and then you see it sort of snaking through this narrow space on the right. And it can work very good for a number of places where the plant maybe is kind of serpentine or it's pretty much in a straight line. It does sort of restrict where you can put the plants, and because it will put out the water, at predetermined lengths of measure. But then again, you don't have as much leaking, and you don't have to monitor it to see if water is leaking out where it should be. It's a little bit more reliable. But any of these devices can fail. It's just, I like the idea here in this sort of an ornamental bed with these flowers, where you can put this in place and put it pretty much right at the ground line. Just another option for you. This is back to, in a ground cover setting, more of that micro spray approach. Whatever these devices are that you use, you always have to think about where the water is coming out and the plant material height. So on the left, a very low growing ground cover. On the right, it's sort of a perennials, low growing perennials. It's going to splash a little bit up on the rock, but as long as it's over the top. Now here's where if you're wetting the foliage, you'd want to be doing this in the morning hours so that the foliage dried before noon and you didn't promote any disease. But you're going to need something to hold it in place, and you can see a stake in both situations. This is a type of device that is used for trees and shrubs, and it's a little bit along the lines of what we saw in the vegetables. The one on the left is on our campus, our city campus, where they've just put in a whole bunch of new shrubs in a shrub bed. And so weaving this leaky pipe along there works pretty well. On the right is one that's not in one linear line, but in two sort of wraparound lines. It's the same type of material, but I really like it because it's a little bit more flexible than just a straight line. So it's good to see that these types of things are available as well. So you just have to look a little bit to see what is available and what we can use in various locations. On the left is one that one of our master gardeners was using. Again, it's a netafim material, but again, this is pretty clever, pretty flexible, where they wrapped it around a newly planted tree and were able to adapt an existing type of device that you normally think about in a straight line, but again, a little bit more creative in the way this was going. So just outside of the root ball to keep that nice and moist over the top of the mulch. And then probably the very first way I learned to water trees and shrubs was sort of just laying on the ground. We have a friend in the business, excuse me, in one of our cooperating agencies, Natalia. And this is kind of her favorite way of watering. I have a dram water diffuser here on this one. It tends to spread it out just a little bit. Her favorite way was just to lay the hose on the ground. Now, this is one you're going to have to move around manually, where you move it from, say, 12 o'clock to 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock and just keep moving it around. But again, very efficient. We're not losing much water to the sky, to the atmosphere. For establishing, you can see this soaker hose. It looks like, again, the netafim on the left are ready to establish a new planting for trees and shrubs. Now on the right, we're using a little bit more mature plant, and knowing that the roots have expanded out 10 feet in all directions from the root mass that was initially in the ground. And so we're watering the turf, but also watering the tree where they share the same root zone. We know that the roots of this tree are probably going to be in that 12 to 18 inch range, and the turf is probably going to be in the 3 to 6 inch range. So whatever the turf doesn't use, the water is going to soak down to the ground. You just need to make sure that that is happening with some kind of probing device that we'll be showing here in a little bit. When it comes to watering turf, we have a variety of devices. The problem with watering turf is that we pretty much have to wet the foliage. So we want to do it in the early morning hours as best we can. The device on the left is a pop-up spray head. The one on the right is a pop-up spray head, but it's a strip pop-up spray head for narrow spaces. We generally don't like narrow spaces of turf because they're hard to do anything to. They're hard to fertilize, they're hard to aerate, they're hard to water. They're hard to do anything to. But if you're stuck with one, this is at least what you should be using, is something along this line where it doesn't water 180 degrees and only waters a narrow strip on either side of the pop-up head. The one on the left is what we call a geared rotor. It's probably become the standard for most turf settings. Of course, there's still a variety of others out there, but the geared rotor has been pretty popular. The one on the right is called a stream rotor. I think it's just cool to watch because it puts out a stream and it sort of rotates. It's sort of a half moon rotating device, which is just kind of fun to watch do its thing. But the others tend to work back and forth like windshield wipers. If you don't have an in-ground system, the rain train that you see on the left works pretty well for rectangular shaped turf. It doesn't throw the water very high in the sky. It just kind of gradually works along the hose. And if you've ever seen these, they have these big tires that kind of grip into the ground and work it along. Works pretty well. They're a little bit pricey, but they do its job pretty well. The one that I have on the right is really what I call a spot waterer. Whereas if you have an area that the irrigation system has a difficult time in reaching, you can turn this on about halfway and it's only going to water about, maybe an area that's maybe 10 by 10. And you can just add to it, to your regular system sort of manually this way. Whichever one you use, I really like to think about what happens after you put it on. And some of this has to do with the soil type. Clay soils absorb water more slowly than sandy soils. And our friend Brad Jacobowski from Penn State is illustrating this in a variety of ways. So you put this on and you put on an inch of water and it's going to soak in differently depending on what kind of soil you have. In a pure clay, it's going to soak in wide but slowly in a depth standpoint, and just the opposite if it's more of a sandy soil. The slope has a lot to do with what happens to the water after it leaves the device. You can see on the right one particular part of a landscape that's basically unirrigated, and it gets regularly abused because the trucks like to drive across it, but very little infiltration on this area that does come from Mother Nature, which is really interesting to see the one on the left, which is wonderfully green. So we know that they're really watering the one on the left just to keep it green, yet a lot of water is running out to the sidewalk on the left. So pretty inefficient really, and kind of unfortunate. They're wasting a lot of water. I always like to think about what's happening. Again, we can reduce the amount of water that's running down a slope, the one that you see on the right, with some type of soaker hose or more direct system that you see on the right. Again, limiting the amount of water that is running off. On the left is an oscillating type of sprinkler. And I have concerns about throwing the water that high in the area, and then of course on wetting the foliage. But if it's a windy day, some of that water, maybe up to half of it, is going to be lost to the adjacent property, and that leads to inefficiencies. I always think about this, the same kind of thing here. You see on the left, lots of water being lost. This is kind of one of those wind tunnel vortex kind of settings where just a lot of water is being put out, and obviously in the foreground, lots of water being lost to the street. It depends on what kind of irrigation device is being used on the right and how big the plants are going to get. These are Vinca, and so they're probably going to get to be about twice of this size. If the irrigation device has a tall riser that's going to push up the center part about another 18 inches, this is probably okay. You're still wetting the foliage, but what you really don't want to have is where the water runs into the middle of the foliage, because then you can end up with problems. This is a situation where they probably should be paying a little bit closer attention than they are. You can see where there's a device and how poorly each of those is distributing water. And pretty much every green spot is where there's an irrigation head and just not getting to the next head. You're supposed to be able to get coverage from one head to the next, and this is obviously not happening on the one on the left. The one on the right is what I'm seeing a lot now in various landscapes as I drive around. This is a dead zone. And again, it's pretty typical of what you see where that you don't have head-to-head coverage. That the irrigation, if we don't have rain in the eastern third of the state, you're going to see this. You have pretty good irrigation coverage on the left and the right, and pretty poor in the middle. A couple more bad examples, I guess. If you look very closely, you'll see an oscillating sprinkler on the left. Gee, a photo I took 20 years ago. And it's straight behind the rock, if you're looking for it, kind of just pretty much center of the lawn, which is good, except there's a big pin oak tree in the way, which is going to really diffuse where the water is going. And you can also see that most of the driveway is being watered at the same time too. So pretty inefficient. This is one of the reasons that we don't like oscillating sprinklers unless you have no other option. And then again, things break. This is a Netafim sprinkling device that has just simply gotten old and cracked and is spraying. Instead of coming out cleanly, it's just running water down the street. So you always got to watch your system to make sure it's running efficiently. Yes, things break, and this head on the left has broken, and probably the top blew off or got hit with a lawnmower. And so this is the wrong kind of bubbler, because we have lots of closely spaced plants called turf grass, and it's not spreading out uniformly over the whole area. It's just watering a few very closely spaced plants about 6 inches wide instead of 6 feet wide. And then plants grow. So this pine tree has grown across the top of this geared rotor head. And what we really need to do is either cap it off and stop irrigating or move the line, one of the two. But obviously a big problem on the right. Now, here's what I was talking about before and how big how tall the riser is going. If it's going up above this foliage, then it's fine. But I have a sense that it isn't, because they just did a lot of pruning and shearing on this plant in order to make sure it gets up and over the top of it. And I just have this feeling that it's a perpetual problem. And then in a horticultural sense, shearing this plant several times a year is just not healthy for the plant. Most horticulturists don't like shearing anyway, and I certainly am one of them. But having to do it every 5 or 6 weeks is really not a good sustainable practice. As is this, the one on the right, where water is spraying up on the fence, and that's showing you where you're getting the distribution, or in this case, the lack of good distribution uniformity. Not only is it hard on the fence and horrible for uniformity, it's also killing the grass as it joins the fence because it's getting too much water. So either the fence came first or the irrigation came first, but the two are not compatible. So I always think about the water after it leaves the device. And the way we know that is to test for the soil moisture. Now, our favorite device in the horticulture, landscape and environmental systems team is the screwdriver. And we like to stick it in the ground and just see how moist it is. You can tell that you're looking at a good irrigation pattern if it looks like the second photo, where it's just moist and a little bit of moist soil sticks to it. It's not muddy, it's not dripping with water, and it's not powdery dry. So moist is good, wet and dry is bad. You can also use a coring device like this soil sampler that also gives you an idea what the soil structure looks like, or you can just dig a hole. When you go to plant a new tree or a new shrub, you're going to dig a hole anyway. So it's one of those things where digging a hole will tell you what the soil moisture is like. These are relatively new. These are soil moisture sensors. Our friend Steve Melvin has pointed out some of these. He's got a lot of experience with the agronomic irrigation world. And this is something that just attaches to the valve box with an irrigation system. And it will actually shut off the water if the soil sensor says that the soil moisture is adequate or wet. And so just shut it off, and then it'll allow the system to run if it's dry. So there are a number of different ones. That Rainbird has one, and on the far right you see one from a company called Irrometer. But there are pros and cons to different devices, and it's something you could look into. If you have an irrigation system in ground for your turf, talk to the person who repairs it, and you probably have one because they break all the time. So I think about $300 as an add-on will be a way to make sure you're in good shape. If you don't want to use a screwdriver, then this is the next best thing. The screwdriver is still probably the best because you can move it around, and it's easy to use for both vegetable gardens and flower gardens and turf. But this is just another option. We also want to know about what the roots and where the roots are when we do soil testing. The one on the upper left is a small ornamental grass. You could also think of it as a small perennial, like an astilbe or a coneflower or a goat's beard. The one on the top middle is a juniper shrubs. It just kind of shows you where the roots are. They had to do some root work here, some construction. So thanks to Extension in Maryland, who ripped these, after these plants were ripped out, they got to see where the roots were for these, oh, I don't know, kind of half mature junipers. Pretty neat. The upper right-hand corner can show you turfgrass roots. The lower left-hand corner, I had never really seen a palm tree's roots before. And this was just kind of a neat way to see them where this washout was. And, you know, they're there and they do spread. There's a lot of, it's a monocot, so there's a lot of roots right at the base, but they also do spread out. The Morton Arboretum in Chicago has given us this photo. This is the typical elm tree, oak tree, linden tree, Kentucky coffee tree, the one in the bottom center. The one on the lower right is one that I encountered when I was putting in some plants for my daughter. And this is a linden tree root that is right below the sod. And then they go down just like the illustration that you see in the bottom center, in that sort of 12 to 14 inch range to 24 inch range. But, you know, a little digging goes a long way in determining what's going on. And then the moisture wetting profile. So this is a good example of right after this irrigation emitter ran, it's neat to see where it ran and where it ran to and how deep it's going in the ground. So again, the screwdriver works really well for knowing how moist it is and where it's moist when you're thinking about running the system and knowing where the roots and where that water went. These are some new plants of a couple different types. We have a new turfgrass plant. Actually, this is from my perennial bed. Perennial beds, you know, whether you seed new grass or you get bluegrass to grow into the perennial bed, which happens all the time, because that's where the best rooting is in a loose soil. You can see the lower left there, you can see a new rhizome coming out. That's a Kentucky bluegrass plant. Actually, they're both tall fescue and Kentucky bluegrass plants in this photo. In the very center is a brand new small tree. And this is a situation where I'm trying to loosen some of those new roots so they don't continue to be circling. And then transplanting a small dogwood tree from one place to the other. So keeping this area moist really does help to think about it when you're watering new versus established plants. In the vegetable world, again, we're thinking about what's that effective zone depth. This is taken from one of our NEB guides that a couple of my fellow colleagues have worked on. And it's just interesting to see the different plants and the effective root depth that they are having. And you know, you look at asparagus versus eggplant versus lettuce. Very interesting. And I do have a reference for this that you can use at the end of this photo, or at the end of this presentation, that you can go right to our NEB guide online and find it. So established vegetables versus established trees. And now trees have both spiker roots and lateral roots. And the spiker roots are for stability, and they're typically formed in the early life of a tree. And then the major stability comes from the pancake of roots that develops long term, that you can see there over time. So when you're watering a tree, it's important to water at the base. Kim Coder, who's a researcher at the University of Georgia, talks about this 40-40-20 rule, where you get 40% underneath the drip line, another 40% of the roots just outside of the drip line, and then 20% even further out. Now, each of these landscape sites are a little bit different, and you think about plant moisture needs. We have all types of different landscape sites, and I just put a few of them in here, and then plants that like it in those particular areas. So it's really good to know if you like a certain plant and you just got to have it, well, figure out whether it likes dry shade or wet shade or hot and sunny or half and half or whatever it is. And I just put a few examples here that you could see to help illustrate what I'm talking about. But different ones are going to like different things. And so everything can't be moist, not dry, not soggy. For the most part, that's where we're at, but there are a lot of specifics as well, and it's important to consider those. So for example, here we have a low water plant on the left, sedum, by a high water plant or a need to keep it moist plant. It's not a high water plant, it's a need to keep it moist plant on the right. And the irrigation device is watering strictly for that purpose. On the right, we've got kind of a mess. We've got a lot of plants all mixed together. And I asked the homeowner in this case to do some measurement of how much water was coming out of his irrigation devices in his lawn. And about 3 times more water was coming out and being deposited on this front yard than he thought was. And that's what killed the tree. So you had a sort of a medium water user with a bunch of low water users, and it just was a kind of a mess because they were all mixed together in the same landscape, which was getting 3 times more water than he thought was going to. So what we want to do is what we have on the left. We have a separation of turf and ornamentals. These irrigation plants, or these plants right around the mailbox, are kind of low water users. The turf grass is kind of a medium water user, and then the trees behind medium to low, which is great. On the right-hand side is sort of a violation of that. All you have to do is look at the green color of the turf, which is being fertilized and watered heavily with some wildflowers, which are low water users right in the middle. And then these struggling blue spruce, which actually there's no mulch there. What you're seeing are dead needles that are falling off the tree because they're being overwatered, and actually kind of forming a little bit of a mulch. But just when you're mixing plants like this, it's hard to deal with that. The bottom lines of irrigation and some strategies here. I counted up 6 S's that are important to consider. Soil type, as I've mentioned, the slope, the sun and the shade, the season of the year, the species, and then this separation. And so through this presentation, I've talked about all 6, the soil and the slope and the sun and the season, the species, and the separation. We want to keep the roots moist, but to the preference of the plant. That's something that's really important to know what that preference is. In all cases, though, we want to irrigate to the bottom of the root zone. We can use a variety of strategies. For example, on a slope, there's a strategy called a delayed start, where you would water, let it soak in, and just before it started to run off, you would turn the system off, and then you would aerate for greater infiltration and try to increase uniformity, and then start the system up again. Pretty much without too much restriction. The time of day, morning hours are generally best because they're lower winds. The leaves have a greater chance to dry off before the end of the day. And then a good bottom line and strategy is to audit, or to take a closer look at the irrigation system, to just watch it run, to measure the output, and just do a good look-see to see what's going on. Here's what we do in an audit. We turn it on and just watch it run. Stand there with your cup of coffee and just look and see, are we spraying the street? Are we irrigating into the mailbox? That sort of thing. Then you fix those obvious flaws, and you fix the biggest flaw first, the worst flaw. And you can do it yourself. You can hire an irrigation company to do it, whatever. We're talking about measuring output with cans like you see on the far or the middle right. You can use catch cans. There are special predetermined cans you can use. Replacement parts, making adjustments is good. And then once you've got a few things measured, it's always a good idea to try it again and see what fixing those big flaws did. And then, try it again and try to trim just a bit. Try a 10% trim. So if you're running a certain zone for half an hour, try trimming it by 10%, which would be 3 minutes, down to 27%. See if the turf suffers as a result of it, or your vegetable plants suffer as a result of it, or whatever. And we do have more information online for you as you can go forward. There are a number of things you can do during the growing season. Certainly monitor the natural rainfall received. Consider the season of year and that draw of water from the atmosphere, certainly a lot more evapo pull. Monitoring the soil moisture, as we've talked about, generally turning the system off is a good place to start, and then running the zone according to each zone's unique needs. That's a hydro zone. Considering watering according to the species. For example, here's some amounts for Kentucky bluegrass and tall fescue. Tall fescue has a deeper root zone, and so probably doesn't need as much water to keep it green. As we showed before with vegetables, it's important to consider the important plant stages. And then also for fruit and tuber development, if you're growing onions, if you're growing tomatoes, if you're growing apples, whatever you're growing, there are certain plant stages where it's important. For example, with fruit trees, late fall is kind of the time of year when bud set is occurring for the next spring. And so therefore, it's important not to have drought going on at that time. Here's that reference for more information on vegetables and fruits for you to, or you can simply Google moisture needs of vegetables, University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and this publication will pop up for you. So a number of things that you can do, some different changes that you can make during the growing season as you move along.